Hello, friends and enemies, heroes and villains. Welcome to Epic Realms. Today's guest is an award-winning game designer with credits for D&D, Star Wars, and numerous board games, including one of my favorites, Lords of Waterdeep. Rodney Thompson, welcome to Epic Realms. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
I appreciate you being here. Today's an interesting episode. What our audience may not know is because we're doing this live on a Friday, but it's a pre-record for December 23rd's episode. So the podcast will drop on that date. So I just appreciate you coming in and making time and working with our schedule and getting this to work out today.
Yeah, like I said, it's tricky when you're offset by a couple of hours and people have, jobs and families and kids and everything. Just
Yeah.
trying to schedule a podcast is a lot like trying to schedule a D&D session sometimes.
Ain't that the truth? Ain't that the truth? When we talk about your career and we talk about like a lot of board games, a lot of tabletop role playing,
Yeah.
what kind of came first in your world? Did you first discover board games or tabletop role playing games when you were younger?
Oh, role-playing games for sure. In fact, I never really played any hobby board games until after I'd already gotten hired by Wizards and moved out to Seattle. And I had a group of friends that I played games with at Wizards who were also into board games. So that's what got me into this. But when I was younger, like in junior high, I played some D&D Second Edition. Very first D&D campaign I ever played in was an Al Qadim campaign, so
Oh,
that still has a soft spot in my heart.
same.
But most of what I played in like high school time period was the West End Games D6 Star Wars game,
Yeah, yeah.
and unfortunately, I was getting into that game right as West End was sort of self-immolating, but at the same time, I benefited from a lot of fire sales on West End D6 products.
Right. For
I
sure.
still have my entire D6 Star Wars library just right off here to my left that I can't part with because it was my first gaming love.
I had a fire when I was younger and I lost everything
Mm.
except for I still have the Imperial source book. So I'm
Oh,
happy
so
about that.
good,
It's one of my
so
favorite books
good.
from that one. Uh did role playing ever kind of get in the way of like school or life? Did you ever like I'm going to go role play instead of do my homework or anything like that?
No, not really. It was funny. My first year of college, like I got to college, and it was much less stringent than my high school was. Like my high school was like a college prep school, so I, was used to like huge amounts of homework and a lot of classes every day. Then I got to college, and it was like, oh no, I only have like 4 hours of class every day, and not nearly as much homework. So in some ways, I had more free time at that point. And a guy that I met on the floor of my dorm, was like, "Hey, see you're into D&D. Do you want to play some D&D sometime?" I was like, "Yeah." And that started a campaign that lasted for the first like 2 or 3 years of college for me, where we would get out of class at like 2 o'clock in the afternoon and then walk down to it was called the Strip. It's basically like a road lined with restaurants and stores and everything, but there's a game store down there. And we would go down there and we would play from like 3 o'clock in the afternoon until midnight, just playing D&D for like literally 8, 9 hours, 2 days a week for like the first 2 years of school. So in a lot of ways, uh, it not only did it not interfere, but when I was in college was like my prime
Yeah.
gaming time, my prime D&D time, and even like high school and everything, just because it was the '90s, and I was in Tennessee, so the gaming population was not huge there. Finding a group of people to play D&D or Star Wars with was tricky, and so I would a lot of times go long stretches without a group to play with, right? So it never really interfered or anything like that. In fact, it's funny that like a lot of people who don't have gaming groups or don't have regular people to play with, I spent a lot of times playing RPGs by imagining the campaigns I was going to run in my head or imagining the stories I was going to tell, and that led to me like doing a bunch of homebrew stuff for Star Wars,
Right.
which in turn led me to create a website, which in turn like the dominoes start falling, and eventually it's like, oh, I got hired by Wizards of the Coast to run the Star Wars role playing game. So it yeah, it never really interfered. It just also it was a lot harder back then to find a gaming group in small town Tennessee than it is now with the internet, right?
Yeah. When you were playing then compared to now, and maybe it's the same, but did you prefer to be a player or a game master?
Um, I I generally prefer to run games overall, just because I think it helps me stay focused and engaged at all times. Although I like it certainly is a challenge, and even low prep games, you gotta kind of keep a lot of things going in your head, right? So broadly speaking, I prefer to run, and I think uh, that has helped me because a lot of times I end up being sort of the anchor player for a game group that, I go and I form the group and I find people who want to play and I'm the one that runs it. Um, but I will say one of the nice things these days is that I have, regular gaming group that we play once a week where we rotate games every 3 to 4 months, right? We pick a new game and we change games, and a different person runs it, right? So like right now, I'm running a playtest game for my upcoming role playing game, but we've got one more session of that, and then we're going to switch over to I think Daggerheart is next,
Okay.
and one of the other guys is running that, right? And we've been doing this for well, more than 10 years, let's put it that way, because I was still at Wizards when we started this group, and it's nice because like I get to run some things, I get to play a lot of games, I get to see things from both sides of the screen, and it's kind of exposed me not only just to new games, but also to like the differences between how different games treat the game master versus the players, and where a lot of the game's focus is, because there's a lot of games that I've played over the last 10 years as a part of this group that I'll be running and I'll have a really hard time with it or whatever because it doesn't give you a lot of really great tools. Or on the flip side, I've loved running it because it's so easy to run, but then the players have a totally different experience. And so, like, I get to see kind of both sides of that. I get to play some, I get to run some, and in some cases, we've gotten to do both. Like, there was a time where uh, I was running the Star Trek Adventures game, the Modiphius Star Trek Adventures game,
Yeah.
and I was co-running it with my buddy Logan, who is the like another person member of the group. He's the lead designer at Paizo for Pathfinder,
Oh, all right.
and so like he was my co-game master, and when he would run, I would play as a player, and when I would run, he would play as a player. But it's Star Trek, so it's like an ensemble game,
Right.
right? Or like an ensemble story, anyways. So it wasn't weird to have my character, who was the captain of the ship, be prominent in some episodes, and then have his character, who's like the chief security officer, be prominent in other episodes. So sometimes we get to see both sides at the same time, right? Again, a really long-winded way of saying that I generally prefer to run, but whether that's a chicken or egg with because I'm always the person, or always I was always the person that had to run.
Right.
Couldn't tell you the answer to that one.
But doing that process of changing them so often, God, you got to see a lot of cool mechanics and a lot of really bad mechanics in game systems because you have to
Yeah,
learn all those systems, right?
yeah, and it's funny because that sometimes pushes us away from more complex games unless someone really, really knows it, right? Or sometimes we're like, you know what, this game's getting a lot of hype. We should try it out, and it means we spend a lot of time learning the mechanics, or one person spends a lot of time doing research on how the game runs and everything. So it's been great for exposure to different games, and plus, like, I've got a giant bookshelf full of games back here that you can see that if we didn't do this, 90% of them would never get played, right?
Right.
So it's a great way for me to to experience these games. And it's funny, the group kind of makes fun of me because I often play the very like middle of the road iconic character. So like we play Shadowrun and I play a Street Samurai, or we play, whatever. Like I play the fighter in D&D or Pathfinder or whatever, right? Because I want to experience like what I think the iconic experience is of that game,
Yeah.
to see what the designers wanted, to see what the the experience was that they were trying to craft. So that means I'm often like the very vanilla expected character, and it's giving me this reputation as being like, oh yeah, Rodney just likes the generic characters and everything. It's like, well, yeah, but
But
mostly because I want to see how this game was intended to be run, right? And like that's a big thing with me, and it's occasionally a thing that makes me a grumpy old man yelling at a cloud, which is I very strongly believe that games are meant to be played, right? And I can read a game all day long and form opinions about it, but until it hits the table, I don't really know what the real true nature of that game is, right?
yeah,
So getting to play these games, over the course of the last, it's probably been 12 years by this point, has been awesome because we've hit like classic games that I just missed. Like I never played Vampire when I was in high school
yeah,
or
yeah,
college or anything because no one in my group was really interested in it, and so I completely whiffed on that, right? But one of the other players in the game is really into Vampire, so I have gotten to play that now and experience like, oh, okay, this is what was the really hot avant-garde role-playing game in the 90s, right?
right, for sure.
And then I get to try out new games that are just coming out. Like I have a mild Kickstarter addiction, right? And so when a new Kickstarter game comes in, I'm like, let's go, let's let this hit the table, right? So you know, it lets me sort of experience what other designers are like doing with their craft and experience like E either the, positive or negative disconnect between what you read and what you play, because there's a lot of games that read bad, play good. There's a lot of games that play bad, but read good,
Right,
and hitting that sweet spot of, play good, read good is really, really, really hard,
right.
and so when I find one of those, it's like, "Oh, found the diamond in the rough," right? It's so exciting.
Does that feel like work to you to sit down and like role play and go through a new game, or are you able to compartmentalize like this is fun, or is work just fun?
Um It can feel like work, and sometimes I have to turn off my designer brain, and just, like, enjoy a game or put aside some small amount of, like, knowledge of a creator or the industry, like, "Oh, here's someone that I had a bad experience with at a con once, and, it's biasing me against their games," or whatever, right?
Right,
Although
right.
that's happened, like, twice ever, so,
But still, it
but
can happen. Like you can have an
yeah,
interaction. First
and
impressions
so,
are
like,
important.
yeah, and, like, I know for a fact that other people have had bad experiences with me because, like, they've caught me at 9 a.m. on Sunday morning of Gen Con, and I'm exhausted, and I'm just like, "Oh, whatever," right? Um, but so, like, I sometimes have to turn my designer brain and my industry brain off while we're playing these games, but in general, um, I love it. Like, I make games because I love games, and I love the idea of creating something that brings people together around a table, and, like, it's, like, the excuse to be social. It creates friend groups, it sustains friend groups, and I love that, and so I love playing all these games because I'm getting to sort of see how other people are interpreting that thing that I already love, right? And honestly, if we start playing something and we're not having fun with it, we stop. We switch to something else, right?
Yeah,
So we never force ourselves to keep playing something beyond the point where it has stopped being fun. Um, just sometimes I also find myself zoning out at the table too, where I'm like, "This is a really interesting mechanic. What could I do with that mechanic?" And I'm like, and then like, I look up and someone's like, "Oh, I asked you a question." I'm like, "I'm sorry, I was thinking about the game that I'm going to start working on in 2 years because this mechanic was interesting," right?
right.
So yeah, like it definitely there's definitely a lot of that overlap between work and entertainment here, but I'm very fortunate that like my day job is in video games. So when we do, when I play role playing games or when I'm working on like a tabletop game of my own, it doesn't feel like the day job that I go to. It feels like something I'm choosing to do, like
Yeah.
something I'm opting into, right? And then at
Right.
that point, it's it can be both entertainment and also like fodder for a thing that I will create then in the future.
You mentioned your day job, video games, and
Yeah.
I'd like to bring it up because a lot of our audience doesn't understand all of the ins and outs of video games. Uh, so there is a term, you know, being a sandboxing designer.
Mm,
A lot of people don't know what does that mean. What does that mean? I
sure.
think it's really cool, and it's something in games like cyberpunk, for example, where like that is a huge part of the game. Like that is a very important role in a game like that, a game
Mm,
like video games. Can you
yeah.
explain what that means as far as
Sure.
game design goes, and what that
Yeah.
means for the game industry?
Well, it certainly means different things in tabletop versus video
It
games, right?
does, exactly.
And in fact, even in video games, it can mean some pretty different things. For me, what it means is that I've spent a big chunk of the last 10 years working on our action gameplay sandbox, by which I mean the things that players use to engage with the combat of the game. So Destiny is a first-person shooter, so all of the guns, all of the player special abilities, things like that, that all is the sandbox, right? And so what I do as a game designer is I am creating those things for players to use. So I'm creating new guns, I'm creating new armor pieces, new abilities, etc. And that's a combination of very technical implementation. Like I'm literally in the tools building the abilities or whatever, but it's also very traditional game design, and that I'm thinking about like player experience, emotional fantasy. I'm thinking about what uh cadence you want to do this on, like how often should you get to do this thing, not just from a game balance standpoint, but about what like feels good, right? And so it's actually funny, when I first made the transition from tabletop games into video games, I was really nervous because I'd never worked on video games before. I'd spent 15 years in the tabletop games industry. I'd never worked on video games, and I was like, I don't like, are they making a mistake hiring me? Did they do they know what they're getting into? But I was so pleasantly surprised when I got to Bungie and I started working on Destiny that a huge portion of my day-to-day job was just the same kind of game design I was doing on tabletop, but through a slightly different lens, right? And I use slightly different tools. So like in a role-playing game, when I'm creating a new, class or feat or spell or whatever, I'm thinking about things like, how often should you use this? What should the player experience be? What are the frustration points? What are the kinds of things that are going to slow the game down, speed the game up? How much do you have to keep in your head? All those are things that I have to think about on video games too. I just have different tools with which to express those things. Like I can use audio, I can use special effects, I can use controller rumble, force feedback, right? I can use reticles on the screen, and I can't use those in tabletop games. But
Right,
by the same token, in video games, I can't rely on a game master, right? Or
right.
I can't rely on physical pieces or cards or things like that. So a lot of it is just like, the pure game design side of it is very similar between, video games and tabletop games. It's just the tools you use and how you implement it is very different. And how you play test it and things like that, of course. Like one of the really nice things about working on video games is that if I am working on something, I can run a quick import on my machine, fire up the game, and start playing it immediately. If I'm doing that in a role playing game, like I gotta wait till
Here's
next
the
Tuesday
recap.
when my
Yeah.
yeah when my group gets here and like play test it then, right? So like the iteration time is a lot faster in video games, but there's a human element to role playing games and even board games, and a physicality element to them that you can't replicate in video games, right? So
Yeah.
it's very very different. But yeah, so like sandbox design in at least at Bungie on Destiny means like creating the tools, the verbs that players use to interact with the game's world. We call it like our 30 seconds of fun, right? Like that 30-second loop when you go into combat and you fight some bad guys and then you move on to the next encounter or whatever. Like that's a lot of where I spend my time. I've also been an activity designer, which is a lot like designing like adventures for role playing games where I do, I figure out like where's the mission going to take place, like what's the flow of the mission, where are the bad guys, things like that. So I've done a kind of a bunch of different things at Bungie. At most of my time, sorry, I'll say the plurality of my time has been as a sandbox designer. But I've gotten to work on a bunch of different stuff as well, and like got to do team leadership stuff for like special events that we've done in the
Yeah.
game. So it's been nice because I've gotten to do a lot of different things, and in all of those different things, I always find there's some thing that I did in my history as a tabletop game designer, or even like you're talking about like the rotating game that I play, and we're playing a bunch of different games. There are times where we'll play like a new role playing game, and I'll see something that I'll be like, oh, this is giving me this experience here. That's kind of like an experience that I wanted to create in the video game. How do I interpret this? So it's definitely beneficial to
Yeah.
go in that direction. And the same thing kind of applies in the opposite direction as well, right? So yeah, it's I don't re- I'm a rambler.
That's
I'm
okay.
going to give you these long rambling
That's okay.
answers.
Well, because that
Um
reminds me that reminds me of something that you said. You mentioned about how like why do they know what they're getting into when they're hiring me?
yeah,
But at the same point, that brings us back to your time at college, because like you started off working with computers, and
I did.
eventually we're like, I don't. The funny quote is like, I got away from that and I changed my major because I didn't want to be in front of a computer, and here you
Yeah.
are. Uh,
Yes.
I laugh at
Yes.
that full circle moment.
Oh yeah. I so when I was in high school, I took like AP computer science, and like I liked it. It was interesting, but it was very basic stuff. And then I got to college, and I found, because I decided when I went to college, I'm going to be a computer science major, right? And I found that not only was it a lot harder, but I was spending a lot more time in like the computer lab debugging things. It was hard to get help, and uh, honestly, the tools and the knowledge base available now so far outstrips. I mean, this was 1998, right? So like the internet was still nascent in many ways. uh, Developer tools were just as basic as you can possibly get, and I think if I had had the kind of tools and knowledge base available today back then, I might have stayed in computer science, because a lot of my problem was just like, these tools are cumbersome. I'm not seeing any real practical value out of the things that we're learning in these classes. And like I know there was, obviously,
Right.
because the university's computer science program was nationally recognized, right? But the kinds of things we were creating is like, write a program that is going to control 6 elevators in a hotel, right? And it's like that's very valuable, but I'm not seeing like I don't understand like what the value of this is. Whereas now, these days, you can download Unreal or Unity or something like that, and be in and making a game that you can play in hours, days, etc. Right? The tools are just so much better now than they were back then. But yeah, like I was spending a lot of time in the lab staring at a command line, and I just found it interminably dull. And so I ended up switching to English, which ended up putting me on the path to eventually freelancing, getting hired, et cetera, et cetera. Then I get hired at Bungie, and Bungie's actually, it's interesting. We're a very technical studio. We expect a pretty high level of technical capability
Right.
from our designers. Like there are some video game studios where a designer does what we call like paper design, right? It's like I'm going to write up all the specs for this, and then you give it to an engineer, and the engineer takes it and they implement it. That's not how it works at Bungie. We are responsible for doing both the paper design as well as the implementation. So I spend a fair amount of my, design time actually scripting, things in our engine and using the tools that we have to build things. But that feedback is so immediate. Like I can tell
Right.
right away if a change that I made is compelling or is doing what I want it to do. Whereas, in 1998,
Right.
if I ran my program and it didn't work, and I'm sitting there in the lab waiting 30 minutes for the lab assistant or the TA to come help me debug because I don't know what I'm doing, right?
Right.
Like that, it just was so slow and so like I couldn't see the fun output of what I was doing. And I think if I'd had those tools back then, I probably would have been able to see like, oh, okay, like I get why I'm learning this, networking protocol, et cetera, right? It'd be super valuable. And fortunately, I spent almost 3 years in computer science. And I still got the minor in computer science. So I still got that far. And that provided me with a good base for what I use nowadays in video game design. And it's funny, like I kind of couldn't have asked for a more perfect combination or like series of events of like building up this very technical programming knowledge base, switching to English, which was sort of my first love, becoming a tabletop game designer, really fleshing out my tabletop game capabilities, my game design, like high level conceptual game design
Right.
capabilities, and then finally getting to merge those two things together in video games, which is really nice. But yeah,
Nice.
I I laugh at myself a lot. Like I'll be in the middle of like scripting something and frustratedly debugging and like reaching out to team members, and I'm like, I'm doing exactly what I was doing 25 years ago, 25 years ago that I quit doing,
Right.
but now I'm
Exactly.
doing other things, but I'm enjoying it now because I see the fruits of my labor
Right.
much more quickly than I would have back
And
then.
you
So
still
it's
get
just
to do what you love on the side, right? You're still doing
so
RPGs, you're still doing
yep.
that kind of stuff. So,
And that was a huge draw for me when I took the job at Bungie was being able to pursue tabletop games of my own design and of my own sort of vision on the
right.
side while also still doing like the day job in video games.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a circuitous and often ironic turn of events. But I can't imagine having got to where I am right now without all that having happened.
Yeah. You mentioned a bit earlier about starting off with like a West End Games Star
Mm,
Wars. And I would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about Star Wars in the RPG world.
yeah,
I
yeah.
loved also the West End Games Die Six Star
Mhm.
Wars. My problem was always like, well, if you have a Jedi running with a bunch of normal guys, well, that doesn't really work out that well in the way that the
Yeah,
rule sets work.
yeah,
And then WotC came out, Wizards of the Coast came out with their
yeah.
first role playing book, and it was
Mhm,
then the problem became like, well, if you want to play something, you have to play it this, and it has to be just like this. There was no
mhm,
modularity. There was no
mhm.
freedom.
Yep,
But
yep.
then Saga comes out, and like it still has classes, but there's a lot of crossover, a lot
Mhm,
of
mhm,
crisscross,
mhm.
a lot of customization. Uh,
Yeah.
and honestly, my favorite Star Wars RPG was Saga. So tell us
Mm,
how you came to
sure.
working on that and kind of like coming up with the system to give it that freedom that system needed.
Yeah. Well, so I mentioned it earlier, but I had a Star Wars role playing game website that started out as just like, here, I'm going to put up all my homebrew material and people can check it out if they want to. And then eventually got, I was putting out enough content that got noticed by Chris Perkins,
Yeah.
and he offered me the ability to freelance, right? And so I freelanced on the D20 revised game for a while.
Heroes Guide, I think, right, was
And
one of your
Heroes
projects.
Guide was the very first one. Yep, yep. And I did a few other ones.
Yeah.
And so when I was when I was working on that, I turned over some stuff, and Chris was like, "Hey, we're gonna do a new edition of the game, and we're gonna let you be one of the core game designers." Right? I was like, "Okay." And at the time, I had worked on D20 Future for D20 Modern, right? And I really loved um, the talent system in D20 Modern, and even today, I still have a very soft spot in my heart for D20 Modern. I think
Yeah.
it's a game that has not necessarily gotten its due over the years, but also holds up better than you think it does in a lot
Right.
of ways.
Yeah.
And so, like, I had a lot of inspiration from D20 Modern when we started working on the Star Wars game, and I think it in terms of like how you structured player characters and everything, I still very much like what we did on Star Wars as far as like making it so that there were a lot of different ways to interpret a soldier, a noble, a scoundrel.
Right.
Obviously with 20 plus years of experience behind me, I would probably make some changes to that. But like on the player side in general, I feel like we sort of threaded that needle between like easy to understand archetypes and a high degree of customizability on like the player side of things. I think with Saga Edition, like I used to be a guest on another podcast all the time, the Order 66
Yeah, yep.
podcast, and one of the things that they asked me, every now and then was like, what would I do differently? I think one of the things that I would do differently these days compared to, is not on the player side of things, right? It's actually on the GMing side of things, because one of the things that I've come to learn over the years is the importance of making running the game easier and faster, and also providing really robust tools to the game master that don't require a lot of mental overhead, right? So like high amounts of inspiration and flexibility, low amounts of memorization and number crunching and things like that. And I think we could have done a lot better job with Saga Edition, making it easier to run, easier to make adventures for, easier to improvise things on the fly than we did, and let the players who only have to really care about their own characters, right?
Right.
Let them have that level of flexibility and crunchiness all day long, because like they have the time, they have the bandwidth to think about that for just their character, but like make it easier to run. And I think that's the big, I don't want to say miss, right? But like the big area where we could have done a much better job with Saga Edition is making it more of a pleasure to run. And I think, you can look at Saga Edition and see a lot of early D&D 4th edition mechanics in there. And in fact, some of those mechanics are being sort of trickled to us as the designers by wizards, who were working on D&D 4th edition at the time,
Yeah.
as sort of a test bed, right? And, I had no idea that they were working on D&D 4th edition at the
Right.
time. It was just like, "Hey, we got this mechanic, we'd really like you to include it." I'm like, "Oh, okay, great." And we would
Yeah,
implement
yeah.
it or whatever, right? But I think one of the things that D&D 4th edition did really, really well was, it made it so that it was a lot easier for the dungeon master to build encounters, right? And build compelling encounters that were, that had exciting enemies in them, but also it wasn't super uh there wasn't a huge amount of mental overhead. Enemies just sort of did what they did, and I think we would have really benefited from seeing some of that tech that was coming in for like the game master side of things, uh in the development of Saga Edition. It's one of the things that even to this day on my own games, I really think about, like, how, like, if you think of like every enemy or obstacle or challenge as a thing that requires just a little bit of processing power, right?
Right.
Like how many different things can a game master keep in their head? There's actually some really interesting psychological studies that humans can only keep about 7 things in their head at any given time.
Yeah.
uh, and
2 if it's me.
well, I'm I just hit 45, so I'm on that way down,
We're about the same age,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But like trying to keep in mind, like how many things can a game master keep in mind at a given time, especially for like more complex games that aren't, or that are more, or maybe I'll say games that don't rely on the players to drive the narrative as much, or to do a lot of the mechanical heavy lifting. Games where like the enemies and the world still has a lot of mechanical elements to it. I think we could have benefited on Star Wars Saga Edition from that. And I think, like, you look at every edition of Star Wars going back even to the D6 ones, right? And they could have done more to enable the game master, to run a game with greater ease. And like D6 wasn't that complicated from a game mastering
No,
standpoint.
it's fairly
But
simple.
yeah, knowing what to do and how to do it, and feeling like you have tools that inspire you or create interesting situations, um, like those are things that any role playing game, but definitely all the Star Wars games could have done a better job, including the one that I worked on. Could have done a better job because the game master is. like it's critical to the game even happening in the first place.
Yeah, yeah. If you have
They
no
have a
game master,
huge amount
there's
of
no game.
I mean, and it's true that if you have no players, you also have no game.
That's
So,
true.
like, to be clear,
You only need one
but
player.
you only need one player, right? And the game master has to keep so much in their head. They have to keep not only the game mechanics and the challenges and the obstacles in their head, but also the world and also the ongoing narrative and
Yeah,
also
the players.
the the player's attention spans, right? And is each player getting enough spotlight time? Is each player, getting what they need out of it? Because every player need has different needs in a
Yeah,
role playing game, or in any game, really, right? But
the
like,
player and their
you
character, right? Because there's you have to keep track of
player
both of
and the
those.
character
What are their
exact, right? Yeah,
motivations?
yeah, exactly. And like, oh, are my NPCs being fleshed out enough that they are leaving a lasting impact on my players, right? Like things like that. So there's so many things going on in the game master's head at any given time that if a game doesn't provide like robust and inspiring tools to them, I think you're leaving a lot on the table that could help your game with a lot of longevity. And like, you can see a recognition of that in a lot of independent role playing games. Like one of the things I love about indie games is indie games that really focus on the experience of the game master as a player at the table, not necessarily from the standpoint of like, oh, that you need to have all these like balanced mechanical systems that make you feel like a player character, but rather like, hey, you're at the table, you have to have a good experience too. You've got a lot of responsibility. You've stepped up to the plate to run this game. But so we're going to make sure that we provide you with these kind of tools to make it so that it is easier and more pleasant to run this game, right? And I
Yeah,
think that's a development over the last 20 years of indie games that has really done some interesting things. And I think, we were talking about earlier about the next game we're going to play is Daggerheart. I'm going to be really interested to see how Daggerheart handles a lot of that because I've heard they have some pretty interesting tools for the game master side of things.
yeah, for sure. When you were working on Saga, one other question I had was, what was it like with the research aspect? Because there's a lot of extended universe, and West End's games did a little of that, but you guys went all over the place with the extended universe and brought in information. There was information there. There was lore that was there that really was hard to find elsewhere.
Yeah.
So bringing in
I
that
mean,
lore and exploring that stuff, what was that? How did that work for you guys?
and part of it was I was just very deep into Star Wars at the time, right? And so I was reading everything, I was playing all the video games, etc. So like it helped that I was consuming any piece of Star Wars media that I could. And remember, this was early 2000s. We were
Right?
still like not all the prequels were even out yet, right?
Yeah.
And we weren't like there were comics, there were books, etc. But it wasn't necessarily even as hard to keep track of everything as it is like nowadays because like there has just been a growth over time of stuff, right? So part of it was that I was very invested in that in the first place. Part of it was that growing up playing the West End Games Star Wars game, West End Games was absolutely for a long time the authoritative resource
Right.
on Star Wars expanded universe lore, right?
Yeah.
The source books that were being written back then were being referenced by authors writing the novels,
Right.
writing the comics, etc. Right? So, like, I had already developed a lot of sort of respect for that aspect of it. And you were talking about the Imperial source book earlier. I love that book, not because it necessarily is the most useful for like here's how to create adventure, blah blah blah, but just like talking about hierarchies and organization
Yeah.
and like here's what fleets are like. It gave a sense of this is how this world works in a way that I think was well, I mean, not I think like it was unmatched at the time for Star Wars, right? So like part of it was that I had developed that sort of respect for that side of the lore. And then part of it was that Lucasfilm had been developing tools that we could use. So I had a great relationship with Lucasfilm while I was working on Star Wars. I was very frequently in contact with Leland Chi, that he was the lore master at the time. We had a database that we could dig into and search for information on different things. And like a combination of different things, we were able to uh, basically like have greater resources at our fingertips than would have had even like 5 years prior to that,
Yeah.
right? So that was a lot of it. It was also nice because at the time, Leland at Lucasfilm was like, I would turn over a manuscript, he would go through the whole thing and do like a fact check in a lot of ways, right? And he would find things that we got wrong, or he would find things that is like, hey, you're connecting dots here that we don't want connected, right? And he's like, you know, and this actually, we could do a whole podcast on this topic, right? But one of the things that I think was really a lesson that I learned from working with Lucasfilm is that the more you connect the dots in the lore of a setting, the smaller that setting gets overall, right? And when you have something like Star Wars, which is literally a galaxy full of possibilities, every time you draw a connection between thing from this source and thing from this source, you shrunk the possibility space, right? And while it can feel rewarding sometimes to people who are really into the lore to make those connections, it's shrinking a universe, right? And so nowadays, like, I tend to look at things as like, it's okay for things to just expand outward and not have to make sense, right? And so like Leland would go through and you identify places like, hey, you're making the universe a little smaller here by saying this. Or on the flip side, he would say like, hey, this is a great connection to draw because it's going to help contextualize this thing that's coming up in this upcoming book or
Right.
video game. We had a great relationship with LucasArts at the time, who was still they were still making video games. So
Yeah.
like the
Force
Force
Unleashed.
Unleashed was one of the first source books I worked on in house, and we had access to a bunch of behind the scenes stuff. We got full scripts for the game. I had a direct email line with Hayden Blackman at the time, right? So like there was a lot of really great cooperation with Lucasfilm and LucasArts on that product line that really helped out a lot. It also helped that over the course of 6 7 years of freelancing before that point, I'd made a lot of contacts in the gaming industry and also in Star Wars fandom, people that I knew could be professionals but also had a love for Star Wars, right? So like one of my good buddies that I made through Star Wars was Jeff Carlisle. He's an artist, right? And Jeff is a big Star Wars fan, but also a really like prolific and reliable artist, right? And in fact, right now he's doing some art for me on one of my upcoming role playing games, right?
Okay.
But like I was able to talk to him and speak to him as a Star Wars fan and say like, hey, we're going to illustrate these X number of ships that have never been illustrated before, or have only gotten one or two illustrations before, or vehicles or whatever. And he could not only be professional about it, not only deliver the goods on time, right? But also approach it from that standpoint of like, okay, I'm a deep Star Wars fan. I know what makes Star Wars tick. I know what the lore is. And so like that just, developing those contacts over the years really, really helped.
That's awesome.
Um, I will say one of the uh, frustrating interactions I had when I was running the Star Wars line at Wizards was we would put out a book, and our books were really good at picking a topic and detailing the known information about it. But a lot of times, unless something was really underserved, we weren't creating a ton of new lore. It wasn't like the
Right.
days of West End
Yeah.
where there wasn't anything, and so they had to create everything, right?
Yeah.
Like
When
we
they're
did have
filling
a
in the
plethora of
IG-88 assassin
right,
droid and all of that, and you're like,
right.
wait, that's what that is in the background for
Yeah,
one little
yeah,
skull
yeah,
cap.
yeah. Like I one of my favorite stories from working on Star Wars is that Bill Slavicsek, who was he hired me at Wizards and he was my manager at the time. Bill was the one that invented the names of like a bunch of species like Twi'leks, right?
Oh, nice.
Because like he had worked at West End Games on those things. But like we weren't creating as much lore. We could take what existed, clean it up, consolidate it, package it in a way because like this was before the ubiquity of internet lore even, right? And like
Right.
Wikipedia was a thing, but it was still in kind of its infancy. But like we were able to present things in a digestible way. But we would get a lot of feedback from people who would buy the book not to play the game, not wanting to play the role playing game, but would buy the book as like an information resource and then trash it and say like, "There's no new information here. This book is worthless," right? And it's like, well, it's not, because it's a game book to enable people to play a game and expand their role playing game stuff. It just happens to be that in
Right.
the past, the role playing game was an authoritative resource. So
Right.
it got to be really frustrating to me when I'd see a lot of negative reviews that weren't about the quality of the material or the accuracy or the game
Right.
or anything. It would be about like, oh, there's no new lore here, so therefore it is worthless. I'm just like,
Yeah, but
that's
play
really
play the
hard.
game. It's for people that don't have that lore. It's
Right.
not.
And we were run into this with D&D sometimes too, where we would say like, okay, this the we're going to do a book on X, Y, or Z, and all the information about this thing is scattered across six different books that have been out of print for 15 years, right? So we're going to take this information and we're going to clean it up and put it back together and publish it in a new format. And you'd see D&D fans would be like, "There's nothing new here. This is useless." It's like, yeah, because you have that book from 15 years ago.
Right.
But the
Exactly.
person that doesn't have that book from 15 years ago, or that doesn't have all six of those books from 15 years ago, they're not going to see the whole picture unless we curate it. And,
Yeah.
it's a different world now with PDFs being such a big part of the gaming industry. Like at the
Right.
time, Wizards didn't sell any PDFs of their products, right? And so many things from pre 2000 say are except for piracy, kind of lost to time because they didn't publish things in
Yeah.
a digital, easily accessible format,
Yeah.
right?
For sure.
So, we didn't have the level of preservation back then. I say back then, it was, 15 years ago,
Yeah.
right? That we even do now, right? Like, because, it just, the technology has changed.
Yeah. For sure. You mentioned D&D, and something that's like a spin-off from the D&D world, and I mentioned at the top, and I know we're coming down on some of the time here, but real quickly, kind of, what was your experience working with Lords of Waterdeep, going from role-playing mechanics to a physical board game mechanics? And I don't want to say it's complicated, because it's not super
Mm,
complicated,
mm.
but its level of gameplay, it was a really high level gameplay board game that was really well done. So how was it going from that to Lords of Waterdeep?
Yeah. So I was very lucky in that I had a brilliant partner in crime on that game, Peter Lee. And Peter was coming from the world of D&D miniatures, so he already had a very tabletop board game mindset when it came to a lot of things. And it turns out that Peter and I were just sort of a chocolate and peanut butter combination
Okay.
where our skills really complemented each other's weaknesses in a lot of ways, right? So I mentioned that when I had gotten to Seattle, I had developed, a little bit of a board gaming group uh, that I had never had before. So I was very interested in board games at that
Okay.
point. Right? And this was, less than 5 years after I moved to Seattle and started playing board games. But one of the most valuable aspects of Lords of Waterdeep's design was that we started simple and then layered things on, right? Like the very first playtest was just a skeleton of a game, and it turned out to be pretty fun, right? But it was one of those deals where we started with a goal of like, let's play this. We want a game that we could play in an hour. And when it comes to board games, if you want to play a board game in an hour, it's got to be tight. It's got to
Right.
be really
Yeah.
focused on what it is, right? So like that helped a lot. But at the same time, I think it really the experience of working on D&D board games really leveled me up as a game designer, right? Because it opened my eyes to things that could be done with physical components, which like nowadays a lot of my role playing games that I work on are very physical component heavy, right? So there's that aspect of it, but also like I learned a lot about resource management and uh, satisfying game engines. I got to work a lot with some of the guys who worked on Magic the Gathering, who helped us out with the development of Lords of Waterdeep and other board games.
Okay.
And Magic has had, uh, you know, it's got its 30-year history or
Right.
whatever, and
Exactly.
has its own mechanics and everything. But there were a lot of lessons that I could learn from them. So I actually think it was super valuable for me to work on Lords of Waterdeep, because as we were developing it, even though we had these very sort of like specific goals for like the gameplay experience, we were experimenting with a lot of different things, and I got to kind of see how different mechanics can work independent of a human element that exists in role playing games. Because
Yeah.
one of the things that is clearly very different about role playing games and board games is that in a role playing game, you are often unable to predict what's going to happen at the table because of the human element. So a lot of what you're doing is you're sort of setting things up, and then the players and the game master take it from there. With a board game, you actually very clearly can predict what's going to happen because the consequences of X move are Y and Z,
Right. Yeah.
right?
Placing
And like,
here or
while you
there.
can't predict every possible combination, you've got a much better idea. So, like, you're kind of evaluating the mechanics just on their intrinsic like quality and balance, and that was challenging, but it also really kind of opened my mind up to a lot of things that I would then take back to role playing games, where I would say like, oh, okay, like we can build a mechanic that is like this board game mechanic, but leaves room for the player to be creative, leaves room for the player or for the game master to interpret, etc. So still doing that thing where you sort of set the players up and then let them take it from there, but give them different ways to approach, the creativity, or different tools to inspire them for their creativity. I think, one of the best examples of this is the Fantasy Flight has their Star Wars game that has all the funky dice.
Right.
That was a outgrowth of their Warhammer role playing game box set that they did that used a ton of physical components and like had its own sort of funky dice. And I think that's a great example of where they developed a sort of new kind of tech in their symbol driven dice that uh was a it was kind of a game changer for how you provided the players with inspiration and tools to go forth and be creative based on a die roll, right? Whereas, nothing up to that point had really done that, right? And that there have been successes and failures. Like my proprietary system that I use for all my games uses a very light touch symbol based set of dice. So, I think you can look at it as very much a two-way street between role playing games and board games as far as like mechanics go, but you just have to recognize when the human element needs to be accounted for and when it needs to be purely resting on the mechanics themselves.
Right. Let's fast forward here.
Sure.
You've got a new game that just is on Kickstarter currently, right? And
We
it's been out
the
there for a
campaign
while.
ended in June.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
ended in June, but people can still donate. I saw people can still
Yeah,
get
yeah,
in
you
on it.
can like Kickstarter did a really nice thing in that they added a late pledge mechanic, right? Which is
Right.
nice because then like people who are like, "Oh, I missed the campaign," well, you can still get in on it, right? Yeah.
So tell us
Uh
about Scratchpad Publishing and tell us about Neon City Outlaws.
yeah, so Scratchpad Publishing is just my personal game imprint. I founded it back in 2017 to start publishing my own games. It is the very definition of a vanity press because even though I often talk about like Scratchpad Publishing is doing X, Y, and Z, there is exactly one Scratchpad Publishing employee, and it's this guy right
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
So it's my personal imprint, and I've done 3 games so far, 2 of which are out in the world. I did Dusk City Outlaws, which is a fantasy heist role playing game. And I did Spectaculars, which is a superhero role playing game. And now I've done Neon City Outlaws. And Neon City Outlaws is obviously a cyberpunk follow up to Dusk City Outlaws. I say it's a game of cyberpunk heists and rebellion
Okay.
because it is very much about being criminals who pull off heists in this cyberpunk world. But I always have tried to make sure that the people that you're robbing deserve to be robbed.
Right.
They're the mega corporations. They're the executives. They're the people who have exploited, the people of this dystopian city. And so your thievery is sort of an act of rebellion against them, right? Obviously, some shades of Star Wars love
Yeah.
coming in there as
Yeah.
well, right? But yeah, it's a tabletop role playing game. That's the third game to use my 100 AC system, which is basically percentile dice for success and failure, and then a couple of different symbol driven dice for like upside or downside. And the big difference between this one and the last two that I did is that this is going to be a series of books instead of a big box set.
Okay.
Like my first two games that I did for Scratchpad were box set games that used a lot of board game like components
Okay.
to make it easier to hit the table. I sort of describe them as off the shelf games where
Right.
it's game night, you don't know what you're going to play, grab it, pull it off the shelf. This one has to be. I pivoted to books for this one. I, just largely because of the current tariff situation.
Yeah.
Board games are more expensive to print and import than a book, right? And so I've had to sort of set aside that. Fortunately, we're in an era now where print on demand card decks from like drive through cards are really quite good quality. So I took,
Right.
some of my older card decks from my other games, put them up on drive through, and they're quite good, right? So I'll still do a lot of those physical components for Neon City Outlaws that I would have done that I did in the past for my other games. It'll just be an optional thing as opposed to a thing that comes packaged in a box.
Yeah. How does the game differ, other than the mechanics of the die 10 or whatever? But as far as sitting down and playing the game, why should people do Neon City Outlaws over the cyberpunk role playing, over
Sure. Yeah.
Shadowrun, over
Yeah.
some of the other games that are set in similar settings?
Yeah. So I sort of I think about it from a couple of different angles. Number one is that like in Spectaculars, my superhero game, this is a game where you build your own setting as you play the game. So the game comes with a uh, I think it's trending towards being about 96-page setting book that is just it's like a workbook in a lot of ways. And as you're playing the game, there will be things that will point you towards that setting book and say, "Hey, go to this entry in this setting book, this corporation, this district, or whatever." And then it presents you with a bunch of like multiple choice questions. You fill those out, and then that becomes an element of your unique setting. So you're building that setting as
Okay.
you go along, and over the course of a couple of different adventures, you start fleshing out this city that is distinctive, that it reacts to the things that you do. There's a whole element of personalization to it that other games don't often have. I mean, some definitely do, right? But
Right.
like, it's a really core element of this. I did this in Spectaculars for superheroes, where you sort of create your own superhero universe. It worked really well, and I wanted to adapt it to the heist genre. And so, a lot of times when you're playing, you'll be like pulling off a job, and it's like, okay, well, the bank you're going to rob is in the financial district. What is the financial district like? And you sort of go through and answer these questions to find them. Some of those answers may have like mechanical impact. So it's like, oh, the financial district is really polluted. So there's a polluted keyword on the district or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So there's that side of it. Another angle is that the game is I mentioned it's a game about rebellion. There's a system I call the revolution, right? And the revolution is sort of like, if you're familiar with the idea of like domain turns from Birthright or the indie game Legacy Life Among the Ruins, it's sort of a zoomed out look at like what's happening in the city around your individual characters. So like
Okay.
each character is a member of a faction, and that faction is doing things in the city that you control. And so there's basically like a revolution phase that you do at the start of every session, or more or less often depending on your group. But it sort of shifts the balance of power. It kind of describes like what's going on in the background. It generates news headlines, etc. Right. So those are sort of two big elements of it. I think also just it's a game that is meant to be robust from the like player advancement standpoint, but
Yeah.
very fast to prep for and very fast to run as well.
I like that concept though about the designing as you go sort of world where you get
Oh
these
yeah.
elements, and you when you look at that, because you mentioned earlier like you talked about connecting these two things, this thing here and this thing here, and you don't
Mhm.
have to connect them because it closes off the world. You kind of get a
Right.
little of that in this, where like you
Yeah.
might have these different things and there can be a connection eventually when you may build them, or there doesn't have to be. So
Yeah.
I see that built right in just from our conversation. So that's a really cool
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah, I think it's pretty exciting. I think also one of the things that is semi unique about Neon City Outlaws is that a core premise that is true across every setting, like no matter what, is that the mind can be digitized and loaded into and out of different bodies. So there's a whole body swapping mechanic that is pretty unique to this one as well. So there's and like that's something that like other cyberpunk settings have done, but I'm using a little bit of like physical components to make that body swapping a little bit easier. So yeah, like I'm pretty jazzed about how it's turning out, and like even now having run this playtest for my group for the last few months. Like I've got this whole cyberpunk city. It's called Neo de Janeiro. It's the cyberpunk version of
Nice.
Rio de Janeiro, right? But it's like it's taken on a life of its own, and there are these corporations that are now as like unique and meaningful to my players as any setting element in an existing setting, right? So like I think it's very satisfying as a player and as a game master to watch a world that is shaped by your actions and your decisions unfold around you. And so I hope other people will find it as fun and honestly as satisfying as I have.
Yeah, that's really awesome. People can find all of that at scratchpadpublishing.com,
That's right.
right? You're
Yep.
on Blue Sky, Instagram. First one's scratchpadpub.bsky.social, or
Yep.
Instagram Scratchpad Publishing, right on
Yep.
there. So people can find you guys over in that neck of the woods as well. So,
That's
Rodney,
correct. Yes.
thank you so much for joining us today. People that are in the live stream, stick around. We're going to do a few Q&As here in just a few minutes. But first, coming up, award-winning writer and creator of the Effing Birds, Aaron Reynolds, is going to be joining us live January 5th. That podcast will be available January 6th. Also, hitting podcast feeds on January 20th, actor and award-winning audiobook narrator, all kinds of awards, Gerard Doyle is going to be joining us. Of course, his latest Chris Paolani book, Murtagh, is out now, and he's done so much stuff. So Gerard Doyle is going to be joining us January 20th, so you'll be able to get that there. So make sure to follow, subscribe, rate, review, push all of the buttons. It helps us, and in turn, helps our guests. So, for Rodney Thompson, I am Nick, and I want to thank you all for listening to Epic Realms.